Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links deck profile. Today we're taking a look at the new Thunder deck that was made possible thanks to all the brand new Thunder cards and the new Thunder skill that we got along with the Genesis Maximum box. Now, I think going into the box after we got to see what the list was, a lot of people had a very similar opinion of the Thunder deck, being that it seemed competent, it seemed okay, it seemed like it could do everything you'd want a deck to do, and it kind of has an out to every kind of situation. But it doesn't really pop off. You don't get these massive attack monsters. You don't get these ridiculous double attacks. You don't get anything that seems particularly unfair. And I think that kind of describes the deck quite well. It feels very fair, but very competent and very strong for what it does. Overall, I think this deck has really been the dark horse of the box and is probably one of the best decks in the game right now, just because of how consistent it usually feels, because of how easily it seems to out most boards and how quickly it can build its own board. But I guess we'll start with the skill, Lightning Trigger. So this skill could be used if the only monsters except level 4 monsters in your deck are Thunder types. So that means we can play any level 4 monsters we want, but everything else in the deck has to be a Thunder monster. During the turn you normal or special summon a level 7 or higher monster with 1600 or less defense face up. So that basically just means any of our Thunder boss monsters, because they have to be Thunder because they're not level 4, and all of our Thunder boss monsters have 1600 defense or less. Decrease the attack of one face-up monster on your opponent's field by that monster's level times 100 until the end of the turn. Then you can change one attack position monster on your opponent's field to face-up defense position. So weakening a monster by its level is pretty cool. That means if your opponent has a maximum, we can weaken it by 1000, which does get very relevant, which we'll talk about in a minute, but also it just means we can weaken anything else. Even if it's a level 4 monster, being able to reduce its attack by 400 can be enough to get our level 4 monsters to attack over them, which can be really, really cool, as well as the fact we can change a monster to defense mode, which is again really, really good if we want to just clear the board. They might have a monster that has very high attack but very low defense. We can just change defense and attack over it, and that's what this deck really wants to do. We want to be clearing our opponent's board every single turn, but we also have access to piercing using our main boss monster of the deck, Thunder Cavalry Trigger Drago. So changing a monster to defense mode and then piercing over it can be a really, really good way to get a load of damage in, and that's what this deck really likes to do. But we can send the top card of the deck to the graveyard. This card gains 300 attack to the end of this turn. Then if your opponent has no cards in their hand, this card inflicts piercing damage. Now, a lot of the Thunder cards do have this stipulation of your opponent has to have no cards in their hand, 1 card in their hand, 2 cards in their hand, and then they gain their bonus effect, which is pretty good. But even if we don't get that, this is still a 2800 attack monster on the attack. That's 2500 attack while being attacked, as well as we have our skill, which can be triggered off this card, which can weaken an opponent's monster and change battle position, which is really, really good. Thunder Cavalry Trigger Drago, actually a fantastic boss monster. And the other boss monster of the deck is Stormbolt Destroyer, and this is another card that never really seemed to do much in the physical version of the game. It is okay. 2400 attack is obviously not 25, but it's the next best thing, and its effect is kind of a little bit lackluster at first appearance. So if your opponent has 2 or less cards in their hand, which again will be most of the time, special summon a level 4 or lower Thunder type normal monster from your graveyard face up to your field. Now, having this effect on a boss monster feels a little bit lackluster, because basically we're guaranteeing that that third slot, or third monster slot, can only be taken by a level 4 monster unless we bring something back and then tribute over it, which this deck, spoiler alert, cannot do. So it feels a little bit unassuming, but being able to just guarantee that you end with 3 monsters on board can be really, really good, especially if 2 of the monsters, for example, are our boss monsters, and then the third monster we get out is just a 1500 vanilla. It's really, really good and allows us to easily deal with our opponent's board, especially since we can change the battle position and weaken one of our opponent's monsters. The Stormbolt Destroyer is actually really, really strong. And then next up, we're going to have our kind of non-Thunder monsters, because again, we can play any level 4. And the first one is Rising Light Angel Essel. This card is actually insane. So during the turn you have not special summon a monster, we can send the top 2 cards of a deck to the graveyard. Then if you activate this effect during the first turn of the player going second, you can special summon 1 monster from either player's graveyard face up to the field. And this card is insane. Basically, either we use this just to fill up our graveyard for different effects, such as we want to get a card back with Sense of Duckbill, or we want to shuffle 1 back in with Blast Jaws, or we want to shuffle 4 back in with Talismanic Seal Array, and all of these effects are just really good, and thus just having cards in graveyard is good. But on top of that, if we get to special summon a monster, it can just be insane. We can bring back fodder to tribute out one of our big boss monsters. If our opponent, for whatever reason, has sent one of their boss monsters to the graveyard on the first turn, we can then grab one of their monsters and then just have it on the field, as well as the fact that if we mill one of our own boss monsters with this effect, we can just grab one of those back from the graveyard as well. And just getting a free Stormbolt Destroyer or Thunder Cavalry Trigger Drago on turn 1 is actually insane, and the tempo is just crazy. So Rising Light Angel Essel is actually completely insane. And unless there's a very good reason your deck can't use it, you should probably be playing this card. The only downside is it is very sacky. Sometimes you will just win or lose a game entirely based on Essel. If you are going second and you get the Essel effect off and you just get a big boss monster, sometimes that is enough to just end the game depending on what you're playing against. And the same can happen to you. If your opponent summons their own Essel and just cheats out a boss monster, you could just lose tempo to the extent where you just cannot really climb back into the game. Now, Thunder doesn't really have to deal with that too much, but other decks certainly do. That's just because Thunder is so good at building and breaking boards that they don't really have to worry about it as much. The next kind of suspect inclusion is Piercing Samurai. This is the level 4, 1200 attack, 1000 warrior monster, obviously not a Thunder. If we have 3 face-up monsters on a field, so we can send the top card of our deck to the graveyard. Again, milling is generally quite good because we have a lot of effects that want cards in the graveyard. We can choose 1 face-up warrior type monster, which is only ever going to be itself, so it basically can give itself piercing, which is still good. And that is because we can change the battle positions of all of our opponent's monsters, which means even if they have a monster that has a ton of attack but low defense, so Royal Rebels, all their big attack monsters with 0 defense. We have the Harpies, which again, 0 defense. We have all of the Cyberse cards, which have 0 defense. There are so many monsters right now with 0 defense, and Piercing Samurai just gets to come in, stab through them, and get in for a ton of damage. So 1200 might not seem like much, but when you add it together with like Trigger Drago's burn, plus the reduction that we get from the skill from Lightning Trigger, it all does add up, and this is how we're going to close out games, by just kind of chipping away at our opponent until they just have nothing left. Next up, we have Censor Duckbill. Fantastic monster. Place 1 card from our hand on the bottom of our deck to add a level 5 or higher Thunder-type monster from our graveyard to our hand. And this is just really, really good for just getting back our boss monsters. Obviously, there will be a lot of situations where we summon them and they get killed, but also we will be milling them a ton, and just being able to easily have access to them and tutoring our graveyard effectively, very much in a similar way to the Phoenix Dragon, is just absolutely insane. And this card's value will only increase as more and more better Thunder monsters do come out. Next up, we have Blast Jaws, and Blast Jaws is actually very, very important to the deck. So if your opponent has 1 card or less in their hand, we can shuffle 1 Thunder-type monster from our graveyard into the deck. This is already quite good, because this lets us reuse some of our monsters. Being able to put Censor Duckbill back into our deck can be really good. If we have multiple Stormbolts and Thunder Cavalry Trigger Drago in the graveyard, we don't really need all of them there. We kind of want 1 of each, so we can just tutor them out with Censor Duckbill, so we can put any excess copies back into our deck to reuse later. But then, 1 face-up Thunder-type monster on your field gains 400 attack till the end of this turn. Now again, this is very good because Stormbolt Destroyer, for example, can now go up to 28, which means if our opponent has a very large board of, let's say, like 3 2500 attack monsters, we can now comfortably clear over a lot of them. As well as the fact that we can boost Trigger Drago and get up to 3200, which potentially has piercing, which is just so much. As well as the fact that, again, between both of these effects, we can get our Trigger Drago up to 32, and then with our Lightning Trigger skill, we can weaken a Maximum, or specifically Drago, down by 1000, down to 3000, which means we can comfortably attack over the biggest monster in the game, which is insane that we can do that in-engine without any tech cards. So that's just really, really strong. For our Legend monster, we've gone with Vorse Raider, and this is basically, he's just a decent monster. We don't really want any more tribute monsters, which means we're kind of limited to Vorse Raider or Magician's Valkyria. Magician's Valkyria has better defense, but Vorse Raider has better attack, and for the most part, we're going to be playing this in aggro style. We just want to summon out 3 guys in attack mode, swing, 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 and get as much damage as we can. So Vorse Raider is just absolutely perfect for that. Then for our last monsters, we have 3 Angler Coilfish and 3 Surge Bolt Lizard. These are both just 1500 vanilla monsters, which again are really good because we want aggressive monsters, as well as they can be brought back using Stormbolt Destroyer, which just works really, really well. The only negative to these cards is they do have 0 defense, which can be very detrimental in the mirror because our opponent can just summon out their Trigger Drago, change one of our 0 defense monsters to defense, and attack over it for 2800 damage plus, which is really bad for us. For our Legend spell, we've decided to go with Tribute to the Doomed. Now, I think this spot can kind of be flexed with whatever, but our deck can still sometimes struggle to get over a maximum. If we summon out Trigger Drago and we have the Blastjaws, sure, we're fine. But if we don't find both of these cards together, it still can be a little bit awkward, which is why we're on the Tribute to the Doomed, just to discard a card and immediately get rid of it. Also, it lets us pop a defense monster, which is really good to clear our opponent's board. We make room to just get in for direct damage, which again, this deck really wants to be doing all the time. And we can also get rid of any other kind of threat that's in our way. And to a similar vein, we also have the Talismanic Seal Array. Again, putting a load of cards from our graveyard back into a deck can be really, really useful. Also helps us prevent deck out, and weakening monsters is insane. Again, any kind of aggro deck is always going to really want Talismanic Seal Array because you can reduce, for example, a level 7 monster by 1400 attack. That's 1400 extra damage. So you could look at it as this card just deals 1400 damage to your opponent, which is a lot when we only have 6,000 life points, as well as obviously gets rid of their monster. So very, very, very good spell card, and even better against maximums because maximums have level 10, so they will lose 2,000 attack, making them very easily just walk overable by any tribute monster. Next up, we have 2 Trail Blitzing Thunderblast. Now, this is a bit of a weird inclusion. Some people have opted to not include this card at all. I personally really like it because Widespread Ruin is the main deterrence to this deck, and that's true of any kind of aggro build. Is anytime your opponent just has a way to blow up one of your cards, you're now weaker on the defense, you're now not getting as much aggro in, the tempo of the game has slowed down. So trying to pop those cards I still think is really, really good, and this is just the best way to do it that we have access to. And then finally, Widespread Ruin is, again, just absolutely insane. Unfortunately, this card still does get popped a lot because a lot of people are still playing back row hate, but when it doesn't get popped and you do get to use it, it can be completely game determinative, especially in the right situation. So this is the deck. Overall, I think this deck is incredibly strong. We did actually pilot a very similar version of this deck, I think like 1 card difference, and we did manage to make top 8 in a big tournament. We only got knocked out because in our game 1, we bricked on spell traps. In the game 2, we bricked on high level monsters. Other than that, we felt quite confident that we could have gone all the way, at least made it to finals, or maybe even won the entire thing, because this deck just feels that good. It's very, very strong, very, very kind of simple to play. It doesn't require this like big 5-head strategy. It's very simple, very low to the ground. It's just good old-fashioned Yu-Gi-Oh, which is quite refreshing to play. So the changes that we made was we did take out one of our extra spell traps. I think we were on 2 Talismanic Seal Array or a 3rd copy of Trail Blitzing Thunderbolt. I can't remember exactly, but we did take one of those out and include an extra monster. And I've seen some people play as few as 4 or even 3 spell traps just to try and make sure the deck doesn't brick. And I do agree with them that that is a very, very strong play, and it's definitely an option. That might even be the better way to play the deck. But for me personally, I found a lot of success with the Thunderblast, just because, again, if we can deal with our opponent's Widespread Ruin, we are in a fantastic position to just try and win the game. But yeah, overall, I think this deck is really jockeying with the Royal Rebels for probably the best deck in the game. The Thunder deck really is that strong. I feel very confident in making that statement, although it hasn't necessarily been showing up in the tournaments as much. It's been seeing a lot of tops, but it's only made the finals 1 time so far, but we have only had a couple of tournaments so far, so take that with a pinch of salt. On top of the fact, this deck doesn't really have any bad matchups. Against the Royal Rebels, it is probably the best deck to deal with them outside of the Rebels themselves, because we can build a board very, very quickly. A lot of decks will have their board wiped and then be like, well, I have to try and assemble something now, and they'll land on like a tribute monster, maybe 2 weak monsters. This deck can quite competently just rebuild their board and then smack in for a ton of damage. And because, again, your opponent is typically going to end with 1 monster that has very low defense and then maybe 1 other monster, we can just change that monster to defense and then pierce over it with a Trigger Drago or a Piercing Samurai, and then clear the other monster and then get in with a direct attack and just hit them back harder than they hit us, which means in the kind of damage race, this deck will oftentimes take the lead, which is very, very good. And in general, I think this deck has a pretty good matchup into most matchups. I can't really think of a matchup where this deck is not, at the very least, neutral, if not favored. So very, very good deck. And I really think that if you're really looking for something to pick up and maybe grind ladder or grind a tournament, this is probably the deck for you. It is a lot less volatile than the Royal Rebels. But let's throw in some replays so I can show you what I've been talking about.
いくよ。やっしゅてやる。 いくよラッシュデュエル ラッシュデュエル